Okay, thank you guys. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a real treat. It's practically on my way home from work in Princeton to my home in Philadelphia. How many of you are primarily musicians? Just so I know, okay. And how many of you are primarily scientists or mathematicians? Okay, it's pretty much half and half, maybe 60-40. What I am going to do is I would like to start with a word. Actually, if we could just have the lights for the first 10 minutes or so. I'm going to start with a word to the musicians to tell you what's coming and kind of give you a little bit of background. And then I'm going to make a few remarks to the scientists and the mathematicians covering some of the same material. Okay, so starting with you musicians who are sort of clustered over here. The simplest possible music theory is a music theory of objects. It's about things that we use as musicians, like major chords and minor chords, or major scales, or octatonic scales, and so forth, right? And so a lot of what we do when we teach music is we teach about important musical objects. But at a slightly more advanced level, when we do music, we teach about transitions between objects, about certain important ways of getting from one musical object to another musical object. So you might learn that Mozart liked 1, 4, 5, 1 progressions, but hardly ever used 1, 5, 4 progressions, right? That's more like rock music. So this idea of formalizing and thinking about transformations between musical objects is one that has gathered a lot of steam in the musical world in the last 50 years. And one of the interesting questions is, can we come up with a natural language for thinking about ways of getting from one musical object to another? And another important question is, what kinds of musical transformations are particularly important? And in the last couple decades, people have really focused on a collection of musical transformations that we call voice leadings. A voice leading is a way of getting from one chord to another. And it encodes a kind of embodied musical knowledge. It says things like, you can get from a C major chord to an F major chord by holding the C constant, by taking E and moving it up to F, by taking G and moving it up to A. And that is a way of getting from C to F. And of course, there are myriad other ways. You can also get between them like this, or you can get between them like that, and so on. And one of the things that I've had the privilege to be involved in is really coming up with a rigorous language for talking about what a voice leading is, for counting them up, for labeling them, which allows us to do things like go through the chorales of Bach and identify all of the voice leadings in the piece and answer questions like, how does Bach get from one chord to another chord? The theory of voice leading has almost infinite musical uses. It can be used to talk about normal classical within key behavior. It can be used to talk about the fabulous tricks that romantic composers use to thwart classical tonality. It can be used to talk about ways to get from one scale to another scale that form the backbone of a lot of what the Impressionists do, or a lot of what contemporary composers like Steve Reich or John Adams do. It can also be used to talk about tricks that jazz musicians know, such as you can replace one chord with another chord and try and tone away. So once you have a good language for talking about the transition between chords, the voice leadings between chords, you have a language for seeing a whole immense amount of musical structure that was not evident before, or rather, that was only known in our bodies and at the keyboard, and would be transmitted by sitting next to your teacher at the piano bench, and the teacher would say, well, do this. And you would sort of internalize this logic, but without having conceptual terms for it. Okay, so that's my note to the musicians. Now I'm going to back up and talk to mathematicians for a second. When music theorists first started thinking about this idea of how to get from one musical object to another, There's literally a famous book of music theory that begins with this picture, you know, an arrow. And the point of the book, the music theorist said, I am curious about how we can formalize this idea of being at S and going to T. Now, of course, there's a well-established set of mathematical disciplines that treat arrows. And so you might look at this and think, you want to talk about category theory, or you want to talk about the theory of vectors. Because music theorists are not always up on their mathematics, the guy who wrote this book, in my view, kind of took a terrible wrong turn and said, the way to formalize arrows is by using group theory. And we're going to talk about groups of transformations that take one object to another. And this had the net result of obscuring some of the deepest and most interesting questions that we might want to ask. And it turns out that one of the things that I had to do when I was starting to think about this topic of getting between one musical place and another is go all the way back to the beginning and say, actually, arrows should not be represented by groups of transformations acting on a whole space. What you really need to talk about, and it turns out this is sort of the magical punchline of what I want to talk about today, to talk about this thing that musicians know, namely voice leadings, the mathematics that you need is the mathematics of vectors in the tangent space of a singular geometrical space called an orbifold. So you need all of the apparatus of differential geometry, and you need to be able to treat singular quotient spaces that are not manifolds and are not well-behaved classical spaces. And it turns out that that mathematics is essentially exactly the same thing as what musicians intuitively knew in their bodies when they're talking about voice leadings. And so, in a way, what I want to talk about today is a really natural translation manual that allows you to go back and forth between elementary music theory of the sort that you teach to an 11 or 12-year-old beginning music student and a whole bunch of mathematics that comes from algebraic topology and differential geometry and the extension of those concepts to singular spaces. Okay, so now that you guys both know what's happening in your own language, I'm going to bring it all together, and by the end of the talk, hopefully, we will be able to understand each other's language a little bit better. Okay, so what I would like to do is talk a little bit about I'm going to give you a basic introduction to elementary music theory from a more mathematical perspective. I'm going to move this piano just a little bit forward. This is a piano keyboard. A piano keyboard is essentially a line, okay? And the piano keyboard is constructed so that we can occupy only certain positions on the line. But if you've ever played violin or tried to sing, you know that the underlying space is fully continuous and that there is in fact a lot of room between two adjacent notes on the piano keyboard. And so a natural model of what we call pitches is actually a line. And when we play a note on the piano, we are articulating, we are choosing a point on a line, and when we move from one note to another note, we are essentially choosing a line segment, right? So we can imagine when we play one note on the piano and then another note on the piano, we could represent the transition between those 2 points by a directed line segment that glides from our beginning point to an end point, to our end point. And there is essentially a one-to-one correspondence between these directed line segments and pairs of points on the piano. Okay, now, if you stare at the piano keyboard long enough, you will begin to discern a pattern, right? There are 2 black notes, and then 3 black notes, and then 2 black notes, and then 3 black notes. And in fact, as we move along the piano keyboard, this pattern repeats via something that I call Maria's theorem, which states that do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti brings us back to do, right? So the musical keyboard has a kind of periodicity built into it. You can think of the analogy here, if the keyboard, if this linear space is like time, the repeating pattern is like time of day. Okay, so just like our experience of time, thank you, has a circular repeating structure in it, so too does our experience of music have a circular repeating structure. And so just as we tell time with circular objects called clocks, we like to represent music with circular structures. You can imagine that what we've done is taken the line and wound it up into a kind of circle, and eventually what we're going to do is just take this and look dead on at the circle so that we forget the depth element, right? So this is what musicians call pitch class space. And as we go up the keyboard, we now have the repeating structure perspicuously embodied, just like Maria taught us. When we go up an octave, we go one time around the circle. Now remember, I said that any two notes on the piano keyboard can be represented by a line segment in pitch space. Okay? For that same reason, we can think of 2 points on the piano, whoops, as determining a path on the circle. Only now the situation is more complicated because there turn out to be an infinite number of ways to get between any 2 points. I can move from C to D by going 2 places clockwise on the circle, or I can go 10 places counterclockwise. By the way, I don't know if you can see, but there are little numbers here, right? So we number the notes so that C is 0, and C sharp is 1, and D is 2, and D sharp is 3, and E is 4, and the major scale is 0, 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11. Okay? So, the trick here now is that we can use our circular structure, oops, to record not just where we've started and ended, but also how we get between there. So the way to represent these things is not just by knowing where you begin and end, but also by knowing what specific path you've taken. So you could imagine if we start at C and end at D, we also want to record whether it was we went up by 2 or down by 10, or in fact, we could go around the circle 3 times. So that would be plus 38. So what topologists call the winding number, how many times you go around the circle, corresponds to the musical notion of how many octaves you've skipped as you go from one place to another. Now, believe it or not, music theorists had tremendous resistance to the idea that you want to represent transitions between musical objects, not just by the endpoint, but also by recording the specific path. Because of this is, I'm talking to the mathematicians, because of this group theoretical heritage, people really didn't want to do that. These vector-like things I'm talking about, the +2 and the -10, you can formalize them as vectors in the tangent space on the circle. And because of kind of the getting off on the wrong foot, music theorists were incredibly resistant to thinking about things in that way. Okay, so music lives on this circular space, and in some contexts, what we want to do is forget about exactly which C we're occupying on the piano, and think instead about, in a more abstract way, where we have disregarded the information about what octave we're in. Let me just say, what I'm basically doing here is creating a dictionary of abstraction, is giving you tools to disregard certain kinds of musical information for certain purposes. I do not believe that there's any one correct method of abstraction. In some contexts, you really want to talk about this full space. It's a fact that a single chord, like a C major chord, sounds very different. And if you play it down here, it doesn't sound anywhere near as consonant and restful. This is actually a pretty good piano, so that didn't sound so terrible. By contrast, a chord that can sound totally wretched right here can sound really quite evocative and peaceful up there. So there's all sorts of musical applications where we don't want to live in this circular space. But on the other hand, there are plenty where we do. And so what I try to do is provide a whole set of different packages of abstractions that you can use depending on what your purposes are. Okay. Now, before we leave this, I want to just talk for a second about what musicians mean when they talk about melodies. One of the essential characteristics of a melody is that it tends to move by relatively short distances on this space or this space. What it is to be melodic is to move around by relatively short distances. If you move by too far, you lose the sense of something being melodic, and in fact, your brain can start to create multiple melodies. I was playing a single note at any one time, and a computer might have thought of that as a melody. But what your brain tends to do is cluster together the notes that are occupying the same rough region of musical space. So one of the things that really contributes to our sense that we're listening to music and not random notes is this moving by short distances on either of those two spaces. So I just want to put that out there as a kind of central preoccupation of, or maybe we'll just say an elementary condition of musical coherence. Okay, what I now want to turn to is not individual notes, but chords. Okay, and I want to give you an introduction to what musicians mean when they talk about chords. So, a chord is a collection of notes. This thing we call the C major chord. Hopefully, can you all see this? Here's what I will do. I will erase this and move this up just a little bit. Now I'm going to play you a bunch of other C major chords, and what I want you to notice is how different they all look on the piano keyboard. And if I had musical notation, they would also look very different on the notated staff. That is a C major chord. Here is another C major chord. Whoops, sorry about that. Ignore those. And there, it's like, I keep choosing 4-note chords. There. This is a C major chord. That is a C major chord. That is a C major chord. They all look different on the keyboard. But of course, they all look the same up here. If you ask an 11-year-old, what is a C major chord, your 11-year-old will say, it's the notes C, E, and G, silly. Because that's how 11-year-olds talk. And if you say, which C? Do you mean this one, that one, that one, that one? They will think about it for a second and say, it doesn't matter. Any C, any E, and any G. And if you say, well, which note comes first? The 11-year-old will say C first, then E, then G. And then you'll say, so this is not a C major chord? And the 11-year-old will say, you're right. It doesn't matter what order the notes come. To be a C major chord, whoops, a C major chord on this circular space is represented by an unordered set of points that's got 0 or C, 4 or E, and 7 or G. And so the basic concept of a chord that musicians use is an unordered collection of points on the circle. The circle, remember, is constructed by our perceiving octave-related pitches as similar. So what it is to be a C major chord is to be those notes. Now what I would like to do is show you what it is to be an F major chord. So first we take a C major chord. And now I'm going to show you an F major chord. And what we're going to try to think about is what major chordness consists of. That is an F major chord. Here is an E major chord. And here's an E major chord. and you're probably getting the gist already, to be a major chord is to be related to all the other major chords by rotation. And rotation is important because it is an isometry, a distance-preserving operation. So it turns out that the musical brain actually doesn't care very much about where you are on the circle. For most of us, if I played a C major chord and then said, okay, here's a C major chord, and then had you go run around the building a couple times and came back and said, okay, let's go back to that C major chord. As long as I waited 2 or 3 minutes, you would not notice that I had played a different chord, which is kind of astonishing. It's like if I had a green sweater on and made you run around the building and you came back and was wearing a blue sweater and said, okay, we have this green sweater, and you wouldn't notice that. On the other hand, we are highly sensitive to the distances between notes. While we're relatively non-sensitive to specific positions on the circle, unless we have this unique and special genetic mutation called perfect pitch, which is kind of like a superpower. Unless we have a superpower. People with perfect pitch, it's an amazing thing, because it gives you this superpower, but it also makes you a tiny little bit of a whiner. But they always say about how hard it is, because what they mean is they have to do a little bit of work sometimes, as opposed to the rest of us who have to do a lot of work all the time. Anyway, it's as if we were totally insensitive to the difference between blue and green, but we're highly sensitive to how the relation between blue and red was like the relation between green and orange. Okay, so we're very, very, very very sensitive to distances as opposed to individual positions. One thought about this is that this is connected to hearing commonalities in speech between men, women, and children, all of whom speak at different pitch levels, but who are going to be making very similar contours, right? So you can imagine, you know, or singing the same song, you can imagine that a baritone man will naturally want to sing down there, whereas a little child might more naturally sing up there. And we need to be able, it's more important to hear the resemblances among those two things than the differences. Okay, so what it is to be a major chord is to be related by rotation. It's to have the distances 5, 4, and 3 in that particular order. What it is to be a minor chord, as many of you know, that's minor, and that's major. And so they are related by the operation that, that geometers call reflection, which musicians call inversion. Major and minor have the same distances between their notes, but going upwards in one direction and going downwards in another direction. It is also useful sometimes to think of major, It is useful to think of major and minor as being related by what I call approximate rotation, because you can move from major to minor by approximately rotating. So in many musical contexts, the exact relation of reflection is less important than the approximate relation of rotation. Okay, so that's what it is to be a chord. A chord is a collection of points on the circle, and a chord type is a set of distances so that it relates all chords by rotation. Now, while I'm here, I would like to mention that another elementary property of musical coherence is that in many musical styles, we want our chords to sound roughly similar. Okay? So there are many musical styles that use consonant chords like I'm using. There are also plenty of musical styles that use more advanced chords. There are plenty of musical styles, mostly written by graduate students, that use highly dissonant chords. There is almost no music that moves back and forth. You know, each other. Look, if you're going to use complicated dominant chords, your tonic chord should not be a, that doesn't work. You gotta have enough kind of consistency between your different chords. And Arnold Schoenberg said this too. He said, look, if you want to follow me and use these dissonant chords, you better not have any of these guys in there because it's just going to sound wrong. So the notion of harmonic consistency is built very deeply into our musical expectations to the point where people generally laugh if you kind of really violate it. So, one interesting fact now, and this is something that I talk about in my book, and it was in the science article that I first published, is using even just this simple circular representation, we can actually figure out something very important about how two fundamental kinds of musical coherence relate. The first kind of coherence being the melodic coherence that says notes in general like to move by short distances. And the second harmonic kind of coherence, which says it's good if chords sound similar, meaning are related by rotation or nearly so on the circle. Because it's actually essentially a math problem. What we are looking for is two pairs of points on the circle, two sets of points on the circle that are related by rotation or approximate rotation, which gives you the harmonic consistency, but which can be linked by a set of short distance paths on the circle, which I am calling a voice leading. And so if you actually think about it for a little bit, you'll figure out the conditions under which this is possible. For instance, it turns out that the C major chord, the major chord, is virtually optimal from the standpoint of mapping itself to its different rotations. No matter what major chords you choose, it is pretty much the case that there will be a nice short path between them. Any two major chords can be connected by fairly efficient moves on this circle. By contrast, if you're a Schoenberg fan, and I am a bit of a Schoenberg fan, just full disclosure here, and you choose this chord, and you decide that you would like to move to this chord, you're basically out of luck. Okay? There's basically no efficient path between a chord whose notes are all scrunched up over here and a chord whose notes are all scrunched up over there. And so if you think about this for a tiny little bit, you'll probably come to realize exactly what it is about the C major chord that's so special. What is it that allows it to move to all of its rotations by relatively efficient paths on the circle? What is it about the C major chord?
Almost equally distant.
That's right. Its notes are spread relatively evenly around the circle. For those of you who play sports, the best way to think about this is in terms of how you play defense in sports. So in sports, there are two kinds, bear with me, there are two kinds of defense that you can play. There's what's called man-to-man defense, where each person is assigned a partner on the other team. The short little guy is assigned the other short little guy, and the big tall person is assigned the big tall person. And that's kind of like mapping one chord to another based on this rotational pathway. But the other way you can play defense in sports is assign each player a region of the field. And you say, whoever comes in your region, that's the one that you guard. You stick to whoever is down around here, and you stick to whoever is down around there. And coaches in youth soccer leagues or youth basketball leagues spend all of their time teaching their players not to do what they are naturally inclined to do, which is all hang out talking to each other in one corner of the field, because it doesn't work to play zone defense there, because the other team goes here. So believe it or not, the major chord is special because it plays zone defense with itself, right? And that's what all these wonderful romantic moves are. So, For you non-musicians, classical harmony sounds roughly like this. There's a lot of this stuff in classical harmony. Schubert loved to do stuff like this. All of this is manipulating the special properties of the major chord mapping to its different rotations. So it turns out that one of the things you might want from your musical materials is to be divided equidistantly around the circle so that you can map efficiently to all of your rotations. Let me just make a point that people are often confused by. It turns out that you don't really want to be perfectly even. You might think that perfect evenness is even better than near evenness. But let me play you what perfect evenness sounds like. I'm going to play the analog of this with a perfectly even chord, and it sounds like this. Do you hear the difference between that and this? With a perfectly even chord, check out how the notes always move. Oh, I've screwed it up. Ignore that. They always move in exactly the same way. Whereas with an uneven chord, the notes always move slightly differently, which creates the effect of multiple melodies. And this is what musicians call counterpoint, the artful combination of multiple melodies, each with their own individual distinctness, so as to produce a series of sonorities that sound similar. And what we have found is that the easiest way to do that is to use sonorities that divide the circle approximately evenly. And it turns out that if we look at the chords that divide the circle approximately but not perfectly evenly, with 2 notes and with our 12 chromatic notes, the best we can do, the closest to perfect evenness that we can come without going to perfect evenness, is what's called the perfect fifth. And with 3 notes, the closest we can come is the major triad. And with 4 notes, the closest we can come is the dominant seventh. And with 5 notes, the closest we can come is what we call the pentatonic scale. And with 6 notes, the closest we can come is something you don't know about. And with 7 notes is the major scale. And so now we come to a magical little discovery, which is that the chords that divide the octave nearly but not exactly evenly are also the chords with the magical property of acoustical consonance, meaning they sound intrinsically restful. And there's basically a simple acoustic reason for this. Basically, the most consonant chords divide the frequency space octave completely evenly, and then we take the logarithm of frequency to get this space, they become nearly even. What this means, as I say in my book, is that if you were called before God at the dawn of time and asked to choose the music, the materials for humanity's music, there are 2 possible answers that you might find yourself giving. You might say, well, God, I would like chords that divide the octave, the pitch class circle, nearly evenly, because then I can map them to all their rotations and write beautiful contrapuntal music to praise you with in churches. And then God would say, that sounds great. And he would hand you a little suitcase with the perfect fifth and the major third, the major triad and the dominant seventh, and all the familiar materials of Western music. On the other hand, you might say, God, I am sorry, I am a bit of a hedonist. At the end of a hard day of hunting and gathering, the last thing I want to do is egghead music. I would just like some chords that sound good, some chords with the intrinsic property of musical consonance. And God would say, righto, and hand you the exact same chords. So there's this magical fact that these two totally different sets of musical properties converge on a single set of objects. And for me, one thing that I think this means is that the familiar laws of traditional tonality are not exactly arbitrary. It's more like they are, in some sense, irreplaceable. I think that in the early part of the 20th century, some composers thought that tonality was just one planet out of thousands of habitable musical planets. Just like in early science fiction, we imagined beings living on Jupiter and on the moon and everywhere else. And the picture that I have is a little bit more like the modern picture where the Earth is the only habitable planet that we know of. And in some sense, in the broadest sense, traditional musical organization is very, very, very hard to replace. Now, that being said, there is, in fact, a second solution. Let's go back to the teenagers or the 11-year-olds chatting and playing bad basketball defense. It turns out that chords like this do have a magical property of their own, which is that they can map their notes onto themselves by short distance motions, or they can move to nearby transitions. So what this means is you can use these chords not to imitate classical traditions, but to write a kind of buzzing, blurring music, where you can imagine many different melodies all moving around with these notes, creating a kind of stasis. So you can actually solve the problem of harmonic consistency and melodic coherence in a second way, namely by moving around in one of these very clustered chords. And the astonishing thing is that composers discovered this strategy after they had been playing around with atonal musical materials for about 50 years in the music of Lutoslawski and Ligeti and to some extent Xenakis. And they invented, I like to think of these composers as having discovered the intrinsic sort of capabilities of these highly unusual chords from a traditional standpoint. Okay, so that's the basic thing that I have to tell you. What I'm now going to do is tell you that thing again in a slightly more confusing way, but a much more beautiful way. A chord, we have seen, is a set of points on the circle, and what I call a voice leading is a set of paths on the circle connecting two points. Mathematicians find this way of representing music with multiple points on a single circle to be extremely uncool. It is not what any mathematician worth their salt would ever do. Just, yeah. So, what we are now going to do is pass from this uncool point of view, where we are representing chords in a very intuitive way with multiple points on the circle, to what mathematicians would call the configuration space. So instead of representing a chord with 2 points on a one-dimensional circle, we are going to represent a chord with 1 point on a two-dimensional space. This is the configuration space of that. For you mathematicians in the audience, this is T2 mod S2. Okay, the two-dimensional torus, which is ordered pairs of pitch classes, where we are gluing together all points related by reordering. And so here I've got a point at 0 and a point at 4, and there I've got a point at 0, 4. And when I move on the circle space, from one point to another, each note can be imagined to glide to its destination. And over there, the single point glides to its destination. And just as we saw that there are infinite numbers of ways to glide between two different pitch classes, there are also infinite number of ways to go between two different chords. And these are what I call the different voice leadings connecting C, E, and D, F in this case. And so this space is exactly like those old video games where you zoom off one side of the screen and reappear on the other. But of course, if you zoom off the upper half here, you reappear on the lower half, and vice versa. So this space is what mathematicians call a Mobius strip. The space of two-note musical chords is a Mobius strip, and voice leadings are represented by line segments in this space, and chords are represented by points. But the really cool thing is that it's not an ordinary Mobius strip, because some of the spaces, some of the points on the space, the upper and lower points, act like mirrors. To think about this, imagine if you take C and move it up to E, and E and move it down to C. Now imagine each note gliding to its destination. And you will see that halfway through this transition, you start repeating the notes you've already heard. So, what I call voice crossing is represented by bouncing off these mirrors that are at the edge of the space. And, so what that means is that this is not a regular old geometrical space, a manifold, it is an orbifold, and those things up there are singularities, and to really deal with this space, you have to do some very careful mathematical thinking about how exactly you want to represent these mirror-like points. For us simple-minded musicians, it's not so bad. We just imagine each note gliding to its destination and look at the picture in this space. And sometimes that picture bounces off the edge of the space, just like a pool ball bouncing off the bumper. And we just trust that the mathematicians are going to work out how to represent that in a nice way. Okay, so it turns out, this is the space of two-note chords. Quite wonderfully, it turns out that there's another space of three-note chords. This is the space of three-note chords. It is essentially a three-dimensional triangular prism that has its top edge glued to its bottom edge. Any three-note chord that you could possibly play, is represented by a point in this space. Any voice leading between three-note chords is represented by some line segment in this space. You can actually download this program from my website. You can zoom around and rotate it and tell it which chords you want to look at, and so forth. There's a four-note space, which is a four-dimensional space. You can also do funny things, like you could say, you know, I want to not consider major and minor chords to be separate. I would like to look at the space of three-note chord types. So here is a space of three-note chord types where rotation is factored out. So rotational motion has no effect. But non-rotational voice leading like that is represented on this space. So there's a whole wonderful menagerie of complex geometrical spaces, each representing different levels of musical abstraction. I think this is my favorite one, because it packs so much information into such a tiny, basically comprehensible space, and of course, because we can actually build it. So if you go to the Math Museum in New York City, you will see the space of three-note chords. And each of these is what's called a theremin, meaning that you can touch it and hear its chord. And so you can play the geometrical space. There's a laptop hidden under here with a little program I wrote that plays the music of the chord. And so what's amazing about this is like the combination of music it represents. It can burble along without repeating for pretty much forever. And it does it in this package that you can literally put your hands on and walk around. So I encourage you to go check that out if you are so inclined. Okay, so if you want to learn more about this stuff, you should read my book. The basic point is just that there is this huge collection of geometrical spaces, and they represent very perspicuously both harmonies, as we think of them, we musicians, as points, and voice leadings. So by looking at line segments on these spaces, you can actually reconstruct the specific voice leading that connected the chords. And now what I'm going to end with is a few representations, a few ways of showing you how we can use this material to represent music. And basically what I do in my book is I spend a lot of time talking about the different geometrical spaces that you want to construct for different specific purposes. Let me just show you, let's see. Let me show you one. This is the space of keys. So each of these represents a major and minor key. And what we can do is watch how Chopin modulates in one of his preludes between the different possible keys. So here we are in G major. And then he's going to modulate. This is pretty unique. Oh, thank you. So we can trace the modulation as a voice leading between scales. And now he's going to modulate to C. The voice leading that I'm talking about here is not the voice leading between chords, but the voice leading between entire scales. So G major, the 7 notes of the G major scale, going to the 7 notes of the D major scale, going to the 7 notes of the C major scale. And one of the claims I try to make in my book is that this process of shifting scales is just the same as this process of shifting chords, but on a higher musical level. Now I've got lots of examples of this, but I'm going to end with my favorite one, which is the Chopin E minor prelude. This is a very mysterious piece of music. If you ask 20 different musicians how it works, you'll get 20 different answers. It's a piece of music that involves 4-note chords and hence requires or suggests a 4-note geometry. And those of you who are geometers will notice that this is a tesseract. It's the 3-dimensional shadow of a 4-dimensional cube. And what Chopin does in this piece is basically move between the notes that form what we call a circle of fifths. So that is represented on this space by a rigorous pattern. What you should imagine as you watch this movie is there's a whole lattice of 4-dimensional cubes, and as you move down here, there's another one down here. What I'm going to actually do is just, once Chopin gets here, I will have the ball reappear on the top and just transpose every chord on the cube down by 1 semitone. And so the circle of fifths pattern, the circle of diatonic or dominant sevenths moving down by fifths, will be represented by a series of alternating rightward and leftward moves on this 4-dimensional cube. So he turns right, he turns left. So in a way, that's like the simplest and most common pattern in all of Western music. What Chopin does to make it special is instead of moving between 2 chords directly, he lowers the notes one at a time, creating a whole series of intermediate harmonies which he chooses freely. And so this dialectic between sequential regular motion, pattern, and improvisatory free motion is reflected on the geometrical space by a pattern that's up here, which is first right, then left, then right, then left, and then completely free motion down the lattice as he moves from top to bottom. So this is a nice example of a structure that's totally opaque in traditional notation, that is pretty much totally clear when you look at it from this geometrical point of view. And so let's listen. And sometimes he skips a step and goes 2 units downward. We start at B7 right here. Now we slide downward till we go here. Now we have to move left. Now we slide downward completely freely. Now we move to the A. He skips that one, slides downward completely free. Now he has to move to the D over there, and now he slides down completely freely. That's the first half of the piece. The second half of the piece moves through that space in a different way, but still preserving the underlying structure. Now, of course, Chopin later in life came back and basically rewrote the same piece. This is the F minor mazurka, the last piece that he wrote. Here, it's exactly the same combination of strictness and freedom. Here, every time he leaves the top ball, which represents a diminished 7th chord, he always moves to the left. So that instead of a sequence of fifths, like this, he has this. A descending sequence, a semitonally descending sequence. Other than that, the rules of the game are exactly the same. Free motion, turn left. Turn left, free motion. End of phrase, repeat the game again. Okay, so to me what's really cool about this whole way of thinking about music is that structures that are totally difficult to understand in notation or when you're sitting at the keyboard become much more tractable when you have this geometrical representation. And I'm just going to give you a couple of tiny hints of places that you can go with this. Let me play you one of Shostakovich's preludes and fugues. This is a prelude. Here you have the same 4-dimensional space as in Chopin's 2 pieces, but each of these points represents a scale. These scales are determined by all the ways you can take an F-sharp natural minor collection and lower its notes. And just like Chopin, Shostakovich moves downward on this lattice. So he starts from a relatively normal kind of F-sharp minor collection. And over the course of his prelude, he lowers the notes and lowers the notes until when the fugue starts, he ends up in this crazy mode that you would never hear as an F-sharp minor mode unless you had been led that way down the lattice. F-sharp natural minor we start with. No scale for mid. Now he goes to F-sharp Phrygian. Oh, sorry, to this one. More chromatic motion. Octatonic scale. Now he goes up the one time, and you can hear it blooming up. Okay, now for the recapitulation, it's our first large step downward. Okay, so he bounces around there a lot. The opening statement of the theme is here, the recapitulation is here, and the opening statement of the fugue is here. goes to this, and then goes to this, and then goes to this. And geometrically and musically, this is a very similar process to what's happening in those Chopin pieces. You would never think to associate them until you had gone through this long process of thinking very systematically about voice leading. In the 1 minute that I have remaining, I'm just going to show you one other crazy way in which you can use this geometrical way of thinking. Here is work that I'm doing right now where I use these geometrical ideas to talk about the ways in which you can harmonize melodies that move downward with major triads. And I create a little game board that I claim represents the implicit knowledge that rock musicians have who haven't necessarily gone to music school. And you find all sorts of progressions that from a classical point of view really make very little sense at all. That's not what I want to be playing. That just naturally appear on this game board. So what I would say is that this geometrical approach gives you tools for understanding a huge range of music, from traditional Bach harmony to romantic trickery to the scale manipulations you find in Shostakovich or Debussy or Steve Reich, to the really original and inventive harmonic procedures you find in contemporary rock music. And in my book, I argue that this shows that there's a kind of deep structure linking all sorts of tonal genres that we usually think of as totally separate. There is a kind of commonality between the procedures you find in 16th century music, the Renaissance pre-tonal music, and the music that you listen to on top 40 stations today. That's the payoff musically. The mathematical payoff is that here is an extremely palpable application of some very, very recent and very intrinsically interesting ideas from topology and differential geometry. When you are sitting at the keyboard, you are literally interacting with a geometry, an abstract but lived geometry that musicians know in a very deep way. And one thing I like about those Chopin pieces is that, to my mind, they establish beyond question that Chopin knew the geometry of four-note chords. He manipulated it so systematically that it was very clear that he knew his way around that musical space. The astonishing thing is, of course, that none of his mathematical contemporaries knew anything about four-dimensional singular geometry. And so the marvelous conclusion, it sounds insane, I grant that, but I think it is really actually true, is that there was a point in human history where the most sophisticated understanding of four-dimensional singular spaces was to be found not in the math departments, but in the embodied knowledge of these poor musicians who could only communicate their mathematical understanding by writing incredibly beautiful romantic piano music. Okay, thank you. Turn on the lights. I'll answer questions. People can get food. I mean, how should we do that? Questions, then food?
Maybe a few questions, and then everyone can get food and swarm you.
Yeah, and I'll keep doing questions. Okay, who's got? Yes, sir.
Okay, so
Afflicted by perfect pitch.
I'm afflicted. So in your lectures, you mentioned these hidden roads that form, like they come from overtone series, and there's commonalities between classical music and jazz music and rock music.
Yeah.
But people's ears have changed over time, and do you know anything, or would you be able to shed light on what it is that have made people's ears change over time?
Oh, that's a really good question. So let me just say, look, I don't believe that this way of thinking is an answer to all problems. And so things like ears changing over time, boy, that's like, that's a whole complicated other subject that I might not have anything useful to say. It is definitely true that our ears have gotten more accepting of dissonance than they were in the past. And so, like, we can accept the old idea was that there was a one-way direction of change, and that the ears and the brain and the musical style was evolving in an irreversible way, right? That's the modernist idea. I see more of a kind of push and pull between the composers and the composers who have highly trained ears and the untrained audience. So what I see is evolution followed by snapping back. You know what I mean? And various points of rebellion. Debussy's rebellion against Wagner and Strauss. The popular music rebellion. Louis Jordan's rebellion against bebop, right? He said, I'm not playing that music. I'm going to play rock and roll. So, you know, and the ars subtilia are giving way to... So what I see, there's also a cyclical structure in how ears evolve and change. And so sometimes magical things happen, like, you know, you find... Okay, did I just play Hey Joe by Jimi Hendrix, or did I just play something by Heinrich Schütz? Well, it's in both of them, you know what I mean? And that's an example of the cyclical snapping back that suddenly creates non-Euclidean connections between different parts of musical history. So that's about all I usefully have to say on that subject.
One just follow-up question.
Okay.
If someone wanted to study this trend of regression, progression on like a biological, neurological basis, where would you direct?
Oh, to the biological and to the neurology department. Boy,
Anyone?
that's complicated. Email me.
Sounds good.
All right, next question. Anyone? Yes?
So this cyclic process that you described, this sort of progress in a certain direction and then snapping back, would you say that could describe the 20th century return to tonality,
For
or
sure.
was that something?
No, yes.
Okay.
Next question. Yes.
So I'm a mathematician. not a
Great.
mathematician. Okay. So you've done something that mathematicians have been doing for centuries. You started with a discrete problem and you made it
Yes.
continuous and smooth. Right?
Yes.
And so your configuration space is this discrete space. Your action grid is this discrete space inside this orbifold.
Well, you know, I think of to get the line segments representing the voice leadings, it's helpful to think of the configuration space itself as continuous. And then a scale creates a lattice in there. But actually, the only way we really sort of got going here is by embedding the continuous problem, thinking seriously about the continuous nature of musical space.
Actually, that wasn't my question.
Right, okay.
Right. So my question is there anything canonical? So as you point out, piano has discrete notes. Right?
Yeah.
A string instrument doesn't.
Right.
Do you think there's anything canonical about the choice of 12 notes in the scale?
Well, okay, this is a whole other complicated mathematical question. It's not exactly canonical, but it's a very natural choice, 12. In my book, I talk about, essentially with all sorts of scales, what you're doing is you are imposing a cyclical structure upon an acoustic structure, okay? So for instance, you can think of the diatonic scale. Okay, this is the major scale I'm talking about. This, as imposing this cyclical structure. This should go to there, but we lower it and suddenly we have a stack of 7/5 that returns to itself. So what you want to do when thinking about where the 12-note scale comes from is look at a sequence of perfect fifths, and you want to make the sort of least alteration you can so the top of the sequence is an octave away from the bottom of the sequence. And there's a beautiful way of talking about this in terms of continued fractions. So basically, you know, certain 7, 9, 7, 12, 19 are all very sort of good places to sort of rein in the acoustic generation of infinitely many pitches and create a discretization. And interestingly, in my book, I give similar derivations of all sorts of other scales, like melodic minor or harmonic minor or so on, or octatonic out of that same principle. So there is a whole beautiful map of tuning theory and continued fractions and stuff like that. But the interesting thing is the geometry is all the same. It's just a different lattice in this space. You know, 2-note chords. So one thing that the geometry does is we used to think that every scale was its own world, and that 7-note the procedures in a 7-note scale were unrelated to the procedures in a 12-note scale. But we now see them as, you know, the topology is identical. And so there's analogs. You can actually say that like this sequence of Schubert's, which is also a rock music sequence, is precisely analogous to a very common Renaissance sequence. One is a form of that sequence that one exists in the 7-note scale, one exists in the 12-note scale, but they're the same, they're pairs. Question back there?
Yeah, another question regarding the construction of the shapes.
Yeah.
So specifically with regards to the tesseract,
Yeah.
is the designation of each point arbitrary as a result of the chords that happen to be in any particular composition? Or do
Right.
they share intervallic relationships?
Okay, so the spaces that I'm talking about, the spaces that I described, like
Yeah.
this one,
Yes.
this is the only way to arrange the 2-note chords to satisfy 2 conditions. You've got every 2-note chord there, and the distance between them corresponds to the size of the voice leading. So you can think of the, more precisely, the distance here corresponds to the minimal aggregate physical distance you have to move between them on the piano. So, and there's one of these for 2-note chords, 3-note chords, 4-note chords. This is the only way to satisfy those 2 properties. It's also the only way to do it, to put those things there such that every voice leading is a line segment. So they're really, it's quite rigid. You know, there are other representations of musical structure, but they represent other things. This is the way you represent voice leading and harmony. Now, the problem is I can't show you the 7-dimensional space of 7-note chords, or the whole 4-dimensional space of 4-note chords. So then what I do is I find some piece that I can sort of, I can create a 3-dimensional model of that's coherent. And the Chopin piece is wonderful that way. In my book, there's actually a trick. It turns out that in many cases, when the size of your scale is the size of your chord is relatively prime to the size of your scale, you can actually come up with these marvelous lower dimensional representations that there's a 1-dimensional, a 2-dimensional, a 3-dimensional representation that actually do the trick. So in a lot of cases, this dimensional explosion, these extra dimensionals just kind of fall out of the picture and are not fully necessary for lots of musical purposes. But yeah, there is convention in terms of, you know, when I make these movies, I have to show you just a tiny part of this more.
Okay.
Got one more question.
And then food, and I also will answer questions over email, yes?
So I'm not a musician or a mathematician, so if my
Okay.
question is stupid, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So you have, it's a 2-part question. The first part is that you have modeled the chords actually there in those spaces, right?
Yeah.
But moving between 2 chords, actually you can move in a certain amount of ways, right?
Yeah, usually, yeah, an infinite number, really.
Right. So going through a specific path, like you showed Chopin, right, moving down the tesseract, can you play a different song that will not sound similar?
You mean, well, I don't have it ready to go.
No, but I mean, I'm wondering, would you be able to do something like that?
You mean different paths?
The exact same path, but play a melody that is different.
Oh, well, can I answer a slightly different question?
Sure.
One thing I think that is really cool about those Chopin pieces is they have an improvisational structure to them.
Right.
And so actually, you could, if you were a brave pianist, you could take different paths through, you could sort of connect Chopin's fundamental chords in a slightly different way. And I think that would actually be a daring and deep expression of a logic that the piece has that can't be captured by any one performance. So I think that would be a really cool way to play these pieces. But classical performance norms don't allow for that. You would literally get thrown out of school if you did something like that. If you were a jazz musician playing Chopin, you could maybe get away with it. Now, I could do another Chopin piece where you took crazy paths between the same points. So instead of going, for instance, I went, you know, and that would be some crazy path in the orbifold that would be very long and inefficient. but would connect exactly the same chords in the same order. I'm not sure why one would want to do that, because it wouldn't sound very... I better like the idea of substituting alternative improvisations of your own for the ones that Chopin wrote into his music.
Actually, I'm asking this because if you model it through, you might have already answered that and didn't get it,
Yes.
but now you have already modeled the entire thing through chords. What happens if you model it through the melodies that you play in that specific song and you go connecting through chords to the melodies that they are the objects?
So in that particular song,
Right?
the melodies are almost entirely determined by the chords. There's one little, the melody kind of does a little neighbor thing, but basically, other than that, it's a byproduct of the chords. So that particular piece is unusual in that it's so systematic that the melody is essentially just it's essentially just one of the voices, very lightly decorated, but not much. Okay, you guys get your food, and I will still be here. And so if you have other questions, and if you don't get a chance to ask them, I do answer questions over email. So my email is Dmitri.
Let's thank our speaker.
No, I think there would be.
That's why. Yeah, that was a very good question. You want to grab some food? I gotta go back. I'm having a general meeting. Nice to see you. We'll go out pretty soon. Before you leave. Definitely. Take care. Take care.
Well, now, see, now you know. Now I know what to do with my spare time.
Well, apparently musicians are primarily not
So is this going to be posted? That I don't know. This was just for you.
And then I don't know.
I mean, you know, like a real fractal, it's got infinite number of layers.
You in charge of
No matter how much it's Oh, he came.
What are you up to now, guys? No, thank you. What are you up to now, guys? What are you up to now? You didn't want any more, so I guess that works.
Apparently.
You didn't want any more, so I guess that works.
How you doing?
Yeah, so the octopus has two parts. That part. That one, I don't have that part. And then there's this part. Okay, so one of the people Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's like an increment there, major. So basically, the shortest connection is very good. And if you've got a full-length chord, so yeah, 12 over X.